The first thing to say about debates about the US financial crisis, as well as this applies equally to the EU crisis, is there are always going to be multiple explanations for what caused the financial crisis. What I'm going to show you later on through the slides is each explanation I give will be backed up by a specific book that makes this argument. So if you want, you can go and read that book and get the whole version of the story. But the point is, as long as people can sell books by telling a different story than what someone else's book has written about why it happened, there'll be different stories. Now, you don't have to know the truth for the sake of debating. I don't know what the truth is about why the US financial crisis occurred. What you need to have is a very clear story that you can tell in the debate, backed up by a reasonable use of facts about why the financial crisis occurred, and therefore what policies need to be adjusted to recover from the crisis and to prevent future crises of that kind happening in the future. Whether or not that actually turns out 100 years' time to be the consensus view about what went wrong doesn't really matter. But don't ever let anyone in the debate just kind of box you into the idea that their version of events must be the truth, and so therefore your version of policy responses don't fit the mould, so therefore you're automatically wrong for that reason. You have to contest the story of the crisis and contest the response to the crisis in a sort of policy or model sense as well. Otherwise, you'll lose. So, there are sort of 5 major factors that get talked about in why the financial crisis in the US occurred. I'm specifically going to talk about the US financial crisis and not refer to it too much as the global financial crisis, even though obviously the US financial crisis precipitated what's widely referred to as the global financial crisis, although it had very uneven effects around the world. It was really a kind of developed or advanced economy financial crisis. It didn't really do that much in places like China. But anyway, happy to refer to it that way because the circumstances in the US are arguably specific, and while they might have had the effect of knocking on to other places, the causes, to a certain extent, depending on which version of the story you like, are more or less US specific. So the 5 key versions of the story, and bear in mind, some of these are non-exclusive, and you'll see in a sec, some people's version of these stories are combinations of some of these numbers. But the first is really people talking about how the low interest rates policy that the Federal Reserve pursued after the 2001 recession created too much easy money for the banks. And so the banks went crazy lending money out because they were awash with cheap cash. And so what do banks do when they have lots and lots of cash? They lend it out. And if they got lots of that money very cheaply, then they can afford to lend it out very cheaply. And if they're offering money very cheaply, then lots of people are going to want it. And everybody took it, and so we got a debt crisis as a result. And eventually the music had to stop because the money was being lent out to people who couldn't repay it. Some of those bad debts, what financial analysts call non-performing loans, which is the polite version of someone going bankrupt. As those non-performing loans started to pack up and pile up, then everything went to shit. The second version is government programs in particular created excessive risk as well as moral hazard. So bear in mind when this argument is about the Federal Reserve as an independent body, right? For my group where we talked about independent macroeconomic policy, this is a criticism of the Federal Reserve as an independent regulator of the economy, saying that they screwed up. Some versions of it say they screwed up in response to the directions and the kind of zeitgeist they were getting from the federal government, but nevertheless, as an independent agency, they're responsible for the decisions they made, and those decisions were bad. It's a criticism of Alan Greenspan and others. The second one is saying that federal government, as the elected body of politicians, screwed up by pursuing policies that created moral hazard. For example, the too big to fail phenomenon, that once politicians started to accept there was such a thing as too big to fail, which should make economists everywhere gasp in shock that too big to fail is automatically going to lead to crisis, but also government programs that promoted and essentially forced banks to offer loans to particularly low-income people to buy houses were a source of the crisis because it created the people who could then in the future become non-performing loans. The third argument people make is that financial innovation, which is a polite way of saying a whole lot of really complicated shit no one understood, plus poor regulation of all this complicated shit no one understood, disguised the investment risk, and a lot of people got in over their heads, and when those complicated investment vehicles blew up, they blew up everyone with them. And so we'll see that a bit later on. The fourth one is the global savings glut argument. So this is kind of tying in the US crisis more closely to a kind of global phenomenon, which says it's not really the US's fault that all this easy money came out. It wasn't necessarily because the Fed went nuts with low interest rate policies and what they call the Fed's borrowing window. They didn't go crazy by leaving the window open at too low rates for too long. And it wasn't that the federal government was demanding that banks lend large sums of money to desperately poor people to buy houses that they couldn't afford. The problem was that there were there were savings gluts in many parts of the world. So places like Germany, where people save more than they spend, places like China, where there's huge surpluses being built up. That money has to go somewhere, and that money is going to go to places where the best returns can be found, or where any returns can be found. And so that money started pouring into the US from around the world, and that's what flooded the banks with easy credit. And so the US is, in a sense, partly a victim of global forces which kind of pumped their banks full of money, which then led to wider economic effects. So this is kind of absolving the US from a degree of personal responsibility for itself as a country and as banks and individuals. And the fifth one I should say, is what's sometimes referred to as the consumption cascade. And this is really about putting the blame on individual consumers. So we've got the blame here on the Fed, the blame here on the federal government, the blame here on the banks, the blame here on foreigners, to put it bluntly, and the blame here on consumers. guys. Hilarious as shit. Fifth one. So the blame on the consumers point is that American consumers got very comfortable living beyond their means. And people went from trying to keep up with the Joneses, as they say, to trying to outdo the Joneses. And that led to this kind of spiralling consumption cascade, which then meant people got way in over their heads. And eventually that all had to end badly, and surprise, it all ended badly. So whatever story you adopt in the debate will have features of at least one of these to them. Whether you use the language I've used in here or not is entirely up to you. But importantly, you should be able to recognise your opponent's story just by listening to which version of this they use. And the simple way is listen to who they're blaming. Are they blaming the Feds, as in the Federal Reserve? Are they blaming the US government and the politicians? Are they blaming the banks? Are they blaming foreign international financial pressures that kind of result in the US getting caught up? Or are they blaming American consumers for being greedy? Someone's to blame, or some group of people are to blame. And once you can identify which groups they're putting the blame on, then you know what sort of argument they're making, and you know what the strengths and weaknesses of that argument are. So, let's get the first one. So, Raghu Rajan, I'm going to start with the Conservatives. He basically runs the first and second arguments combined, and is a very interesting and readable book, Fault Line, and explains all of this in far more detail than I'll ever have a chance to do today. And what he runs is essentially the kind of classic perverse outcome, law of unintended consequences critique of government. So there's a standard view. One of the cornerstones of conservative political thinking is this idea called the law of unintended consequences, which is that whatever law governments put in place will always have unintended and usually perverse consequences. That it's impossible for policymakers to foresee all the implications of the things that they do, which means they should do as little as possible because some of those unforeseen consequences can be huge. And the perverse outcome concept is one of the most classic critiques of government that you'll read anywhere, and it basically says whatever the government tries to do, it generally ends up doing the opposite. And if you don't believe, and if that sounds a bit extreme, you should read a book by Albert Hirschman, which is called Futility something. It's got 3 words in the title. Anyway, it's all about how there's three classic arguments that conservatives have been making for all of modern time, and one of them is this perverse outcome argument, and they've applied it to everything from seatbelt laws to financial regulation, and they say whenever governments try to do X, they end up doing not X, and governments suck. So, so it starts with the premise that the people to blame are not the policymakers who engaged in liberalisation, because Raghu Rajan is a conservative economist. He believes in economic and financial deregulation and liberalisation of markets. So surprise, surprise, he starts by saying, that's not the enemy. Right? All these lefty fuckers are out there telling you that we deregulated financial markets and that led to chaos. They're wrong. The problem's not that we deregulated. The problem is, and this is an interesting argument for a conservative to make, which is why I included this version, right? He says the problem is actually inequality. That we've had decades and decades of mounting inequality in the US, where the rich are getting richer at a ridiculous rate, the poor are staying poor, and the middle class is starting to evaporate. They're not kind of picking sides, they're just disintegrating as an economic class in the US. And the reason why that's led to problems is because the evaporating middle class and the struggling lower classes in economic terms are powerful economic lobbies. And they have driven governments in the US to pursue the only kind of policy outcomes that they can to assist people without totally restructuring the economy. So if people are getting essentially poorer and poorer relative at least to their compatriots, or even generally, like in the middle class in the US, are actually getting literally poorer, like wages are lower now in real terms than they were in the 50s and 60s. But people are getting poorer and poorer. What can you do about that as a government? Well, you can help them borrow. So you can do everything you can to assist them to live off credit, because that way they can still maintain their aspirational lifestyles. Now, He's not saying that's good, he's saying that's terrible, but the reason for it is not financial deregulation. The reason is political pressure and piss-weak politicians who couldn't either A, structure the economy properly so people had decent, well-paying jobs, or B, tell people like struggling auto sector workers, you know what, like there's no good future for you where you are now, you need to fundamentally change. They then decided to take the soft option and just hand out lollies to people. So this led to lots of populist easy credit, things like the Community Reinvestment Act is one that's consistently criticised by Conservatives, even though the Community Reinvestment Act was actually created in the 70s by Richard Nixon, but it's been successively kind of opened up and expanded by different governments over time, including, if you're a Conservative, one of the notable changes was under Bill Clinton's regime, where he made changes to the Community Reinvestment Act, which, let's just say, encouraged strongly government-backed mortgage brokers like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to provide loans to inner-city urban black communities to buy homes, because home ownership amongst poorer urban black communities was incredibly low towards the rest of the population. And Bill Clinton wanted to do something about that, so that's one of the things he thought was good. Because what they really did is create a whole lot of easy options for the finance sector. And so the answer is not that bankers were greedy, the answer is that bankers did what bankers are supposed to do. They responded to government incentives. If the government saying there are incentives here if you lend money to poor people, the financial sector will lend money to poor people. If the government saying we will back you up if you fuck up, then the private sector will say, great, risk is lower, let's take more risks because the worst thing that can happen is not so bad. So don't blame bankers for doing exactly what the private sector is supposed to do, which is respond to government incentives. If you believe, if you're one of these big government types who thinks the government should be out there encouraging this and discouraging that, then you can't complain when people actually do the thing that government's telling them that they should do. Now, that's the theory, that's his story. The critique of that is this very conveniently shifts the blame totally away from the financial sector and the people who created these time bombs and buried them all throughout the global economy, and shifts the blame onto politicians for being shit and the population for being dumb and populist. And it's the general bread and circuses critique of government. That things go wrong because the public is stupid and politicians pander to them, and then they want to find a convenient target and they blame the financial guys, except it's pretty good evidence that says the financial guys were pretty highly involved. But also that some of the facts don't quite fit, which is that European nations, which didn't have the same easy money policies, at least not to the same extent that the US had, it didn't have the kind of Community Reinvestment Act kind of policies the US had, still ended up with a financial crisis. In many cases ended up in worse crises than the US did, but didn't have the same policy backing, so it's very hard to fit some of the facts to the theory, and in particular, there were arguably good policy reasons why low interest rate policies were pursued in the wake of the 2001 tech wreck, because there'd been a financial crisis, and it needed to be, which was leading to a recession. There needed to be a response to that, a standard response to that is to lower interest rates. It wasn't just governments who wanted to give people an easy, cheap loan so they could be helping out. It was governments doing what they're supposed to do. So that's the critique to it, that's the theory to it. Let's move on. The second one I put in, even though he's not an economist, he's a financial journalist, is Michael Lewis. I call him a populist, which isn't meant to be critical or pejorative, it's just meant to indicate that he doesn't particularly come from a left or right school of thought in particular, but he does write books that are kind of aimed at giving people a popular understanding of financial phenomena, including the US financial crisis, so maybe it's slightly unfair, but it's not meant to be. His argument, he takes focus on argument 3, which pretty squarely puts the financial sector in the gun as being the most responsible party for the financial crisis. And he says, look, the issue, Raghu Rajan will tell you that deregulation of the financial sector wasn't really a problem. He's totally wrong. It was massively a problem, because what deregulating the financial sector did was it allowed a whole lot of things that shouldn't have been allowed to happen. One of those things was it allowed the kind of speculative type of high-risk banks to merge with the kind of low speculation mortgage deposit holding banks to create these gigantic banks, which then created systemic risk if they collapsed, which meant that they had an inflated sense of their own worth and believed that the government would never let them fail, and so they took extraordinary risks, and lo and behold, some of them were right, that the government wouldn't let them fail. So that was problematic. But it also allowed for some of these things, like complex derivatives, like CDOs, to be created, which wouldn't have been able to exist previously, or if they had been able to exist, they would have been more clearly understood as being the high-risk bodies that they were, because what all this deregulation has done is it's allowed the ratings agencies to become far more powerful than they would otherwise have been, and far less accountable than they would otherwise have been. And so when the ratings agencies got in over their heads and were asked to explain these complex financial products to people, they actually didn't really understand them, and instead of saying to the market, we don't understand these products, buyer beware, invest in them if you want, they responded by saying, these are ultra-safe products that are highly unlikely to explode. And so if you're looking for a very safe place to park your money, you should park them here. And the reason we believe that is that the people who invented them told us that that is what they are. And they're guys like Goldman Sachs who are really, really smart, and we all like to work at Goldman Sachs one day. So that's not really going to happen if we tell them that their financial innovation is stupid. So instead we're going to tell them that it's awesome, and that one day they like us enough to hire us. And so eventually, what you got was all of these time bombs that had been rated as super safe, spread all throughout the financial sector, when eventually they did what risky things do, which is start to fail. They blew up all across the sector, and there was no coverage for it, so the banks exploded. Now, the critique of Michael Lewis's view, even though it's fun to say, and it's probably the conventional kind of public view, is that the greedy bankers did it. And so it's an easy one in the debate to sell to people because they're sort of primed to believe that that's the reason why it happened. Is it assumes that there was this sort of exploitation regime where there were this group of smart bankers who invented this clever, complicated bomb that looks like a fruit and sold it to people who thought they wanted fruit but actually got a bomb, and they swallowed it and they died. Right? But actually, it was the same big banks filled with the same geniuses who blew up as well. Right? It wasn't like Goldman Sachs and Lehman's and all those guys that invented all this stuff, just shuffled it onto dumb, unsophisticated investors and laughed and went, wah, you know, when they all blow up, we'll be the last man standing. They blew up as well, right? They were just as packed full of their own crap as possible. So it may be actually they didn't realise they were selling people crap. Maybe they actually thought this stuff was valuable. But also that it's not true to say that nobody knew that things like CDOs and credit default swaps and stuff were dangerous until they exploded. If you read the financial press, people were starting to complain about these things well more than a year before the financial crisis began. There was lots of literature about people saying these things are actually more dangerous than we think they are. But by that point, the markets were so heavily invested in them, both on the CDO side and on the insurance side. Credit default swaps are effectively insurance for these kind of things. The market was so heavily drenched in both of them, which no one knew how to unpick the problem. And so by that point, it blew up. So it doesn't quite fit all the facts either, but it's one that's very convenient, and it's probably the one that most people believe. The next one is Paul Krugman, and he's written a bunch of books on this, but the most contemporary of them was Discretionary Economics, which he wrote in 2009, so it was sort of his first swing at trying to understand what had happened. He's got a later book which came out last year, which doesn't change his view on this stuff, it slightly refines some of the arguments a bit, and we'll look at that one later on. So he starts by saying, look, let's just take a step back, right? Financial crises are cyclical. The economy goes through boom and bust cycles. It's happened all throughout history and all across time, and different types of economies, capitalist economies, government-controlled economies, everything from like tulip mania in the Netherlands, whatever it was, the 1600s, where people were paying like the price of a house to buy a single tulip, right down to the tech wreck in 2001, which was the opposite of tulip mania, with these high-tech companies which did things that no one understood, which didn't make any money, which blew up. So these things happen again and again and again. The point's not, was there a crisis? You can't start from the premise of thinking that crises are unnatural, and so therefore there must have been an unnatural cause for them. It's more complicated than that. Crises happen. And they happen because in the periods after the last crisis, the more time that goes on from the last crisis, the more people start to become confident that the market's recovering. And market economics in particular is liable to this stuff because it's very confidence-driven than other types of economic structures. And so as confidence starts to grow, people become more and more leveraged. And leverage is just their economist term for in debt. Right? And they borrow more and more because they're more and more confident that the bad times are behind them and the good times are ahead. And what that means is that eventually, by definition, people become over-leveraged, and then some of those things start to go badly, and then the whole thing unpicks again, and you've got your crash, and then slowly we recover from that, and then people start to get confident again, and they become over-leveraged. And these things happen, right? So these things go up and down. But what exacerbated it in the US, it was a series of factors which made us primed for a particularly big explosion, and is making it harder to recover from it. And that's what's important. It's not that there was a crash per se. So, in 2008, just before the crash, the US was running a very large trade deficit. So were some other countries like the UK and Spain, which also, Spain in particular, we'll see later on, went through a whole lot of crises as well. But that large trade deficit was really imposed on the US. Right? The US didn't make a decision to run a trade deficit. Other countries like China went on campaigns to artificially devalue their currency, to promote export markets. Those export markets, by definition, like the economy, the global economy in total is a zero-sum game. If half the countries are in surplus, and the half have to be in deficit on the trade side, you've got to be selling to someone. So if a country like China is pumping out a massive trade surplus, somewhere someone's got to have a massive trade deficit, and one of those countries was the US. And that's not automatically bad, but it meant that really the Chinese were exploiting the Americans. The Americans had low credit environment and aspirational cashed-up consumers. The Chinese were making their products artificially cheap, which meant huge demand for them, and they got sucked into the US. And what you saw is that historically, trade deficits have not really been that well associated with advanced economies. Generally, trade deficits are run by developing countries who are sucking in resources for their own development. They're buying machinery and equipment and services and things to help them develop. And so that's why they're in deficit, also because they haven't developed their economies, so they haven't got a lot to export at that point. So it makes sense that developing countries would run trade deficits and advanced manufacturing economies would run surpluses. But that's not really what happened. And after the Asian financial crisis, where those countries realised how vulnerable they were to economic forces, they started to rack up trade surpluses as a way to protect themselves from future currency crises, because the Asian financial crisis was in large part a currency crisis as much as it was a debt crisis. And so to protect themselves from that, they wanted large surpluses of cash so that they could defend their currencies if they came under attack in the future. So that meant that you had these historical changes in the nature of global trade balances, which the US was essentially a victim of, although not to put too heavy a point on it. So large capital inflows into the US, in other words, people had all this money, they wanted to invest it somewhere, they invested it in the US, led to a huge demand for US bonds, people looking for safe investments. US Treasury bonds are considered the gold standard for safe investments, and very low inflation rates and low yields for long-term bonds. So that pushed, effectively all this money coming in made the market convinced that the US market was ultra safe. It could never ever go wrong because long-term bond yields were so low, that was the market saying no one could ever imagine these things not being paid back. So lending costs in the mortgage market collapsed because with low interest rates, everyone was getting cheap money. Banks had to lend to somebody, so they started going further and further down the income strata to find people they could lend money to because all the other people higher up the chain had got money. Now, that's not to say this was all natural, right? There were things that made it worse. The trade surplus imposed, the trade deficit imposed was one thing. The other thing was Krugman's very critical of the deregulation, which he says made what would need a naturally risky circumstance of being in the higher leveraging cycle of economies. It made it more dangerous by having these badly regulated financial bodies. And he points to things like the Glass-Steagall Act, which we talked about before, which was the thing that had previously separated the kind of risky, speculative parts of banks and the parts of banks that control mortgages and deposits. And the idea of Glass-Steagall was to say, if you want to run a casino, that's fine. If the casino blows up, we don't want all these people who are mum and dad investors who own houses to lose their homes because you bet too much money in the casino. So have your casino over there and have your boring, safe bank over here where people can put their life savings and keep them totally separate so that if one blows up, the other one doesn't go down with it. The Glass-Steagall was repealed and so that allowed a situation that would be dangerous anyway, much more dangerous. But he's also very critical of a thing called shadow banking. And shadow banking is the part of the banking sector that's highly unregulated by definition. Most of the US regulations on banking falls on what's called deposit holding banks. If you're the kind of bank where you can open an account and take in some money and say, I'd like to put $50 in this account, please, and I'd like to have a card where I can take it out from an ATM, then you're a deposit-taking bank. If you're the kind of bank where you can't do that, if you're Goldman Sachs, where people don't have a bank account with Goldman Sachs, if you're that kind of a body, then you're not subject to the regulations that are imposed on deposit-taking and mortgage-holding banks. And so that meant that a whole lot of banking structures were set up specifically because they weren't regulated. Like people wanting to do things which the regulations wouldn't allow. It's the only reason why I didn't set it up that way. Because if you're in the regulated market, you also have a certain degree of government protection. So banks that take mortgages in the US, those mortgages are to a large degree insured by the US economy, by the US government. But if you're in the shadow banking sector, none of your investments are insured. So it's high risk, but it's done on purpose. And some of those things are quite reasonable things, right? Like they're businesses, this is called the repo market, they're businesses that want to be able to borrow money in large sums for very short terms, sometimes days, weeks at a time, whereas traditional banks will only lend you money for, at the very least years, if not decades of large sales. But if you want to borrow $50 million for 3 days, you're not going to be able to go to the Commonwealth Bank for that. But if you go to in the old days, went to Lehman Brothers, they'd be happy to hook you up with $50 million for 3 days under certain circumstances. The shadow banking sector also includes other types of speculation and risky investments that people want to engage in. And the argument says shadow banking is a good thing because it allows for a more liquid financial market. It allows people who want to invest in certain ways to find a place to invest. And we need we need high risk, high return investments in some parts of the economy. Otherwise, we'll never be able to generate the level of growth that we need. I mean, we all want to have a bank account that generates, 4, 5, 6, 7% interest, but standard interest rates are like 2 or 3%. So where's that extra money going to come from? It's going to come from somewhere. Someone somewhere's going to take a bet. And so you need a banking structure that can allow that to happen. But at the same time, by definition, by having a large unregulated sector where people are taking heavy bets, it's not hard to imagine how that can go wrong. So following the crash, the bailout of banks had the unintended consequence of failing to restore growth because it failed to restore confidence. The consumers weren't lacking in confidence in the US because they were worried their banks were going to collapse. They were lacking confidence because they were heavily indebted and they'd lost their jobs. And bailing out the banks didn't help, right? It meant that the banks survived, but all these people who were connected to the real economy lost their jobs or lost their homes. And so, of course, people lost confidence. People are now saving more and spending less. And that's bad for the economy. And it's in economics jargon, it's about what's called the fallacy of composition or the paradox of thrift, which are kind of essentially the same thing. The paradox of thrift is the idea that everyone thinks saving is good, right? Like everyone's been told their whole life you should save money, right? And you should try to minimise the amount of debt that you're in. And you should save for a rainy day and all that stuff. If everybody in the country pursues the policy of saving for a rainy day, then nobody spends, there is no economy and everything tanks. So you need people to actually go out and buy a shitload of shoes they don't really need, because otherwise people who sell shoes have no work. If everybody just were very frugal, we'd be stuck. And the fallacy of composition is the idea that what's good in one part of the market must be good for all parts of the market. So if it makes sense for consumers who are heavily indebted to save lots of money and pay back their debts, then that should be good for the whole economy. But of course it's not true for the same reason that if people who are heavily in debt save heavily and people who are not heavily in debt also save heavily because they're worried that those people who are heavily in debt are going to tank the market, then the market tanks. So Krugman says the US is trapped in this kind of paradox where people are saving because they think that's the responsible thing to do. They're actually making the problem worse and they're losing confidence as a result. So, the critique of Krugman, this is painful for me to do, but I'll critique it anyway, is that it seems to be almost willfully underestimating the level of involvement that governments have. It's almost like Krugman has an agenda to try to suggest that governments are less influential on the economy than particularly conservative economists like they think they are. And it would seem that that's unreasonable. That for decades and decades, US governments were driving the subprime market. There's no doubt about that. The US governments were trying to encourage low income, particularly inner city, urban African American communities to buy homes, but broader than that too. But they were the real core of it to begin with in the early 90s. And so governments did create the philosophy of too big to fail. They did create a degree of moral hazard. They shouldn't be as conveniently kind of left out of the equation as Krugman leaves them out. But nevertheless, there is a lot of really important analysis in there about why, in particular, the crisis is so bad, because the punchline of it is that these things happen all the time, and that economic crises in countries like the US are really crises of confidence, and you don't restore confidence through things like austerity. You don't necessarily restore confidence through things like bailing out banks, although that would seem to be part of it. You restore confidence by giving people sustainable jobs, where they can be optimistic about their future earning power. Okay, last one. Robert Wright. So he's a progressive, of a similar school to Krugman, but has a different philosophy. So if it's worth having him in here, because you'll see this sort of argument around it. And as I say, it's quite different than the Krugman one. So I didn't want you to think that the only kind of left-wing argument is the Krugman one. Krugman makes a very particular type of argument that not necessarily help everyone. This is much more of Robert Reich's argument. It's much more, I guess, of a conventional left-wing sort. So he says, and it's interesting to see the parallels between Reich and Raghu Rajan. Reich says the problem's inequality. Right? Just like Rajan. Rajan said the problem is inequality. But whereas Rajan said the problem is inequality meant that the public demanded the government kind of give them economic candy to make life easy for them. Robert Reich says the economy's been structured to drive people to consume. Now, America's particular brand of capitalism is a consumptive capitalist approach, and people are constantly told that they should consume, that is what they're supposed to do. I mean, think about the day of 9/11, where George Bush is standing in the rubble of the Twin Towers, and he tells people to go about their business and encourages them to shop. Right? I mean, for real. Like, watch the tape back. So this is the kind of American style of capitalism, right? That people should consume. That's important, and that consumption is a part of your identity. It's a part of marking your social status and where you are in your community. And we know from behavioural economics that people don't just judge themselves in relation to where they are and where they were, 5 years ago. They judge themselves against their neighbours. and they see themselves as rich if they're comparatively wealthier than the people they spend most time around, and they consider themselves poor if they're comparatively poorer than the people they spend most of their time around. Now, that's not a rational way to behave, but nevertheless, it's exactly the way that people do behave. And you see this all the time, right? For people who just entered the workforce, and so you've got your first full-time job, and you're in an office building like this one, and you're surrounded by, middle and upper management who earn more than you and have been earning it longer than you, and all of a sudden you want the things they want. You want the fancy suits and the nice briefcases and the, all that crap that goes along with it, because you see that as that's the way people live. That's how people, because I'm now one of those people, that's how people like us live. And you start feeling poorer for not having had those things before, whereas the day before you walked in the office, you never considered yourself poor for not having those things. And equally, when you move into a neighbourhood where everyone's got an SUV, you think that's what I'm supposed to have, and everyone's got a pool at the back and a boat and whatever, that's what I'm supposed to have. So behavioural economics tells us that's how people think, and there's a lot of evidence that says that it's very strongly true. So that leads to this kind of consumption cascade problem, where the more people consume, the more they want to consume. The term in psychology for it is the hedonic treadmill, right? That you have to run faster and faster just to stay in the same place in terms of your happiness, right? That this argument about happiness doctrine, right? That after a certain point of economic growth, countries don't become happier, and in fact they can start to become more unhappy. And the US is one of the wealthiest countries in the world and has one of the highest rates of depression in the developed world, whereas countries that are poorer have much lower rates of depression. That doesn't mean being poor is good, but it means there's a certain point at which wealth becomes problematic, and people start to conceive of themselves in problematic ways, and they shouldn't, but they do. And so the more you spend and the more you start moving up more and more classes of affluence, the more you start mixing with people who are even wealthier than you and even more consuming than you, and that just drives you to feel more and more poor, so you spend more and more. So the problem with all of that is that people in the US, particularly the middle class, have had effectively flat incomes for the last 20 or 30 years. So their aspirations are being driven by television and marketing and media and the places they live in and the places they work and the things they see all the time, but their means to deliver that lifestyle are deeply restricted. So that meant that people have then tried everything they could to increase their incomes. And the first thing they did was they sent women into the workforce, right? More and more households, women are going back into work because they need to make more money, right? They don't really need to. There's a middle class household who could survive with that. They send women back into the workforce just to increase their consumptive status. And when that didn't work, they take on high household debt, right? All this mania we've had in the last 10 years about unlock the equity in your home, right? These are banks telling you, you can borrow more money on top of the mortgage that you've already borrowed for this house, right? Borrow, 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 it's cool, right? Equity is this fantastic magical bucket of money you never knew you had under your bed all the time, just like get stuck into it. So people did that, they started investing in the equity in their homes, and they thought that was okay, right? Because housing prices were going up and up and up. So even though they were borrowing more, the house was still worth more than the total debt. So who cares, right? Worst case scenario, we sell the house, we walk away, everything's fine, unless the housing market crashes. And that's exactly what happened. So the housing market crashes, people are in way over their heads, and anarchy and crisis ensues. So the problem is now we're actually having the economy in the US is starting to recover quite well. We talked about this in my group before about the jobless recovery. We're finding that the wealthiest people in the US have recovered most, not all, most of their losses in the global financial crisis. So if you're in the top 10%, certainly if you're in the top 1% of the US economy, you've pretty much come back to where you were pre-2008. Not quite, but you're pretty close. The pain's over. But if you're in the middle part of the income spectrum, and certainly if you're in the lower part, you're screwed. And households are still effectively decades behind where they expected to be at this point, if they've been saving and earning as they expected that they had. So that's creating huge resentment, right? The middle class and the working class are very angry that they're the ones suffering all the pain for these complex financial things created by the top 1% who have now recovered all their wealth. And so that's creating pressure for change, and the change will need to be a major restructure in the way the economy deals with inequality, because structural inequality was a problem to begin with. Now, the critique of Robert Reich is that this denies real individual agency, right? This makes individual consumers kind of victims of marketing and advertising and campaigns, and says people didn't actually really make objective decisions, they were kind of drug addicts. It's not really their fault, they were sort of driven to consume. You shouldn't hold that against them, right? But at some point we should say, well, if you couldn't afford it, you shouldn't have bought it. And of course, we all sometimes go into a bit of debt to have a fancy holiday or to buy a nicer, clothes or whatever. But we're all supposed to know our limits about just how far we can get into debt, particularly for highly discretionary consumption. It's crazy to get into that much debt, and people should ultimately be responsible for their own behaviours. And of course, the critique of his plan to deal with the crisis is that it's extremely radical. He wants to basically entirely restructure the economy. And I put a link there to a paper by the Centre for Policy the Center for American Progress have just released a 300-page paper on how to restructure the American economy and create hundreds of millions of jobs. It's really awesome. It's incredibly radical. It's about kind of folding the US economy inside out. But if you want to know how to run a model for this, I would take the kind of executive summary of that report and send it to a So let's smash on. So those are the 5 main stories for how the crisis occurred. In every debate, you're going to be a version at least of one of those 5 stories. When in doubt, just pick exactly one of those stories and run it in a very orthodox way. But as you get more comfortable, you can tweak it as much as you like. So now the question is, what does the US do? How does it recover from the financial crisis? And really, there's basically 2 approaches to that. The first is a kind of stimulus approach, and that stimulus approach usually, even though it's not part of stimulus in the literal sense, usually includes a greater degree of market regulation, re-regulating some of that deregulation that has occurred since the 1980s in particular. And the Dodd-Frank legislation kind of did that a bit in the US. It sort of redefined too big to fail, but it didn't actually remove too big to fail. What it did is it changed too big to fail to be defined as systemically important financial institutions. You might be confused, but thinking sounds a lot like too big to fail. But anyway, very close. And of course, the other approach is fiscal austerity. And so, just to be clear, fiscal policy is where the government, the executive, spends money out of its budget, and monetary stimulus is where the central or reserve banks do fancy things with interest rates or borrowing or selling of money to stimulate the economy, which we're going to look at now. So, let's talk about stimulus. What does it mean? How does it looks like? This is a more recent Krugman book I mentioned before. It's a quite short read, it's only about a couple hundred pages, and it's written for a mostly non-economist, non-economically literate audience, so it's very easy to read, and it sort of hammers the point in pretty aggressively. Kruger's become slightly polemic, which means that he has to write for a very wide audience. Stimulus is obviously coming from a Keynesian perspective, so if you follow nothing else that I say today and you're confused, go and read about what Keynesianism means. But in short, Keynesianism, in the context of dealing with the financial crisis, means that government investment should be counter-cyclical. Right? So if the economy is tanking, the government should get in. If the economy is doing well, the government should get out. The standard critique of Keynesian is they get in, but they never get out. And the economy kind of is always distorted by these big governments who never think it's the right time to get out of the way. And that is true to a certain extent. So, what does fiscal stimulus mean in the case of the US? Well, we'll talk about it means the use of government taxing and spending powers to try to put money back into the economy. So, in Australia, for example, when we did our stimulus package in response to the financial crisis, it was a bit of both, right? People got their $900 checks in the mail, which was basically a kind of tax cut. And there was obviously big government spending programs, the building education revolution, etc., where they spent lots of money on traditional bricks and mortar. Monetary stimulus needs a little bit more explanation. This is about monetary policy. For those who are in my session, is about the supply of money, right? About how much money is in the economy and at what price. And usually, some sort of independent central bank, or in the case of the US, it's called the Reserve Bank, regulates the price of money through interest rates. So you might have heard the term quantitative easing. Everyone's embarked on a massive campaign of quantitative easing at the moment. Japan's just gone through the largest campaign of quantitative easing in the history of humanity, which was only beaten by the US, which embarked on the largest campaign of quantitative easing in the history of mankind. So we're seeing lots and lots of quantitative easing at the moment. And it's important to point out that quantitative easing, before we get into the definition of it, is highly unconventional, especially at this scale, right? So a lot of economists, if you read articles and books about QE, will tell you that we're living through an experiment, right? And we are. This is an economic experiment that's never been conducted at this scale. So there are theories and models about what this level of quantitative easing should do, but we won't know until probably 10 years from now whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. But we will of course know what the short-term effects are in the short term. So what quantitative easing is usually referred to as printing money, but of course that's not right? When the government wants to put money into the economy, it doesn't tell the mint, print more money and then we'll drop it out of helicopters so that it circulates into the economy. Nobody actually prints money, but non-financial journalists can't figure out what quantitative easing is, and so they refer to it as printing money because they think the public can understand printing money. This is not the Pauline Hanson thing where she said, well, we just print money if we had to spend on more stuff. It's a different thing. What it basically works is it's about the central bank putting money into major banks in the hope, and I emphasise hope, that putting more money into banks means those banks will lend that money out. Now, there's a big debate. Both on the left and the right, about whether or not quantitative easing does actually lead to more bank borrowing, because the evidence, the economic data is mixed about whether or not banks who have received massive cash injections have actually gone on to spend it, because the banks are also heavily compromised at the moment, right? Carrying lots of weak or non-performing loans. So giving them lots of cash might just make them go, "Ooh, our margins have now just got a bit tighter, right? Like we're a bit less worried about some of those loans blowing up in our face, right?" So it may be rational for the banks to say, "Thanks, federal government, for all this cheap money. We're just going to sit on that, thanks very much, so that our whole bank doesn't implode." So to make sure that the banks are willing to actually put that money back out there to the people who need it, you've got to pump in a lot of money, right? You've got to make them so comfortable with the amount of money they've got that they're now going, "What am I going to do with all this money? I guess I better give it to somebody else." And it's not clear whether all the banks have reached that threshold. So the case for stimulus. This is a kind of a Krugman style analysis for stimulus. Is that the role of the government is to manage aggregate demand. Okay? Aggregate demand means total economic demand. So it doesn't mean the role of the government is to make sure every business always has enough clients for whatever products it's selling. It's that overall, the economy as a whole has enough total demand to utilise the productive capacity of the economy. And the problem with the US is it's drowning in productive capacity and has no demand. So it's got factories that are working at half pace, it's got businesses that are laying off staff because there's not enough customers. It's drowning in capacity when it needs its demand. And so the US government should step in and provide that demand if the private sector is unable to do it, for the obvious reason that the more people who keep their jobs, the more those people will spend and consume and save other people's jobs. Whereas if we stand back and let those businesses just shut down, then there'll be a cascading failure effect where it's not just those people who lose their jobs straight away, but their lost consumption lower demand even further and crush more jobs. It's also premised on the idea that well-targeted stimulus, well-targeted being very important when we see the critique of stimulus in the next slide, well-targeted stimulus has a multiplier effect. That every $1 of government spending has a multiple of $1 effect in the economy. So there's two ways to think about that. The simplistic way is to say if the government spends $1 on hiring someone to do something, that person will then go and spend that money. So there's been two lots of benefits. The person who got the money directly gets benefit, feels rich, and the person they spend that dollar on, they get benefit as well. So the government's multiplied its investments to assist two people, not just one. The other way of thinking about it is if the government invests in productive, in ways to make the economy more productive, then it improves on the investment that it made. So, for example, there might be a business that in the US is doing quite well exporting widgets to country X. And it would like to export more of those widgets, but there's not enough roads or enough port capacity or enough airport capacity or whatever to allow them to export more. So if the government built a $100 million road, it might result in $101 million worth of extra corporate taxes over a 10-year period. So that's a multiplier effect of 0.1%. So the government's made money on its investment. The standard argument is that well-targeted government stimulus can have a multiple of 2 or 3 times. So when I say 0.1, I'm being very facetious. This usual argument is much lower than that. And yes, that leads to a lot of debt because the government is creating money, it's borrowing it from international markets or it's borrowing it from itself, from the central bank, and it's spending that in the economy. That's debt. Isn't that terribly bad? Well, the stimulus argument says, well, thinking about debt in an aggregate sense is stupid, right? So the mortgage that I have versus the mortgage that my neighbour has shouldn't be compared to each other. They should be compared to our capacity to pay those mortgages, not what they are in relative terms to each other. Because if he's a neurosurgeon and earns $1 million a year, if his mortgage is twice as big as mine, he's way better off because he's earning way more than twice what I earn, so everything's fine. So yes, debt will go up, but if the economy grows, then the revenue base will grow faster as well. And so don't get obsessed with the debt figure, get obsessed with the revenue figures for government. And as the economy grows, revenue figures will go up and the debt will be managed. Everything will be cool. And remembering that when it comes to debt, if you're a sovereign state, so if you're a government, a national government, and if you have the capacity to print your own currency, so if you're not Europe, or you're not a country that's adopted another currency, like a dollar or something else, and you have debts in your own currency, then you can never go bankrupt. You just can't, right? You can't go bankrupt. Because if you owe debts in US dollars, and you have the capacity to print US dollars, then if you ever run out of US dollars, you can create more US dollars.
Money
Slow down,
can be exchanged.
So that's not to say that the US should therefore borrow as much money as it likes in intergalactic quantities as long as it's in US dollars. There are consequences to printing money. For example, it can lead to driving inflation. It can also crowd out other investments. It's not an uncritical problem, but it does mean that bankruptcy is not the problem. The problem is what the flow-on effect would be if you were forced to print money to pay your debts. But the reason why US Treasury bonds are considered super gold rated is because the US always pays its debts like a good Lannister, and it has the and it has the capacity to print its own money even if it did decide it didn't have any more. So Shouldn't worry about it too much. Okay, the case against fiscal stimulus, which is, in other words, austerity, which is, if stimulus is a Keynesian approach, austerity is a Hayekian approach. So if you want to read those books, you should, because they're classics of the genre. The case against fiscal stimulus is, firstly, there's a whole bunch of practical problems with fiscal stimulus, which can sound a bit boring in the debate, so you've got to work hard to kind of make them sound real, but they are real, nevertheless. The first one is what's called the problem of implementation, right? It sounds fine to say, well, if we just invest in productive efficiency gains through infrastructure or whatever, that'll be good. Sure, but how do you find them? And how do you find them in a timely fashion, and how do you know that you can invest in them in a timely way that will actually make a difference? It's really hard to do. And not only is it hard to say, well, such and such a community would be able to export more of their widgets if they had better roads, but how do you know whether your investment is not crowding out other people's investment? And this crowding out argument is a very common one for conservative economists to say, every time the government borrows money, it's driving up the rates for other people. Right? Because interest rates are a supply and demand issue. Right? The more risk you take on, or the less cash there is available, the higher the interest rates the banks will ask for to lend out their diminishing resource. So the bigger, if the government goes big and sucks in all the cheap credit, then by definition the cheap credit's gone. And those other people in the private sector who want to go and invest will have to invest in not cheap credit, and that's going to hurt them, slow them down, and discourage them. And of course, a bank is always going to prefer to lend to the government because the Lannisters always pay their debts, so the government's going to be the best client for you to have as a bank. So when in doubt, you're going to choose the government. Second one is the problem of rent seeking. So yeah, sure, maybe you can pump some money into business X, and maybe that business will go and create more products, and that's great. But how do you actually know you're not overpaying them? And how are you going to get off paying them? So it's fine to say, well, we're in a crisis right now, and we have to fund the car companies to keep making cars. When does the crisis end? What's the definition of this? How are you ever going to get those guys to agree? The circumstances have changed now, and they no longer need that support. Businesses become very good at holding on to the support they have because they have a great argument up their sleeve, which is they say, if you cut our support, we will sack the people. And governments don't like that very much. The next one is moral hazard, that the more the government kind of engages in supporting businesses that would otherwise fail, businesses don't have that great capitalist feedback loop of if you make shit no one wants, you go broke. And if the government goes in and buys up stuff just because no one else wants it, then you're not getting that signal about people to say we need to innovate and find new products that people do actually want. And the fifth one is what's called the problem of superfluidity. And I didn't need to use that word, I'm totally showing off, but it's a cool word, you should use it in a debate just because it will make you sound smart. And what it basically means is that how do you know that what you're doing is not totally superfluous? How do you know that it's not completely unnecessary? That you're investing in that business, but they would have invested in their own business anyway, but they're taking the free government money. Or, yes, this market's expanding because more Chinese consumers want to buy product X and it had nothing to do or little to do with your investment in their business. How do you know that what you actually invested in really made any difference at all, that it wasn't just money pissed down the drain? So, those are all the obvious practical problems. And every kind of stimulus program has that kind of problem to them to one extent or another. But there are more philosophical problems that conservatives raise, and conservatives and libertarians split on this, right, which is why I've divided them up. And again, it's about who you are in the debate to know which sort of argument you want to make. If you're conservative, not a libertarian, then you won't make the second argument. If you're a libertarian, then you might make them both. The first one is to say, we don't need fiscal policy, right? We don't need governments to borrow big and spend lots of money. We don't need the building education revolution or all that sort of stuff. Monetary policy can do the job. Central banks can just lower interest rates and provide resources, which is the automatic stabilizer for the economy, that when people aren't investing enough, you make it easier for them to invest, and they do. And all this government debt stuff is not only causing all those problems, but it's totally unnecessary monetary policy rules. It's just slow, right? But the reason why people get obsessed with fiscal policy is that it's a quick hit, right? It's the chocolate bar of economic policy. It gives you that quick boost. But it's not sustainable in the long term. What you need is the kind of oatmeal of monetary policy. I've never eaten oatmeal in my life. What the libertarians say actually is to go one step further, say monetary policy shouldn't exist either. Right? That this is all bullshit. This is all distortion. This is all the government getting involved in stuff it shouldn't do. And the reason why it's problematic for for monetary policy to be engaged in, whether the central bank is independent or not, is because it's the government, it's the authorities, and it's the authorities interfering with the price of money and the price of goods. And that, by definition, has to distort the market and distort investment decisions in a way which can't be in the long term optimal. And so, if the government's going to go out there and print money, and that's going to increase inflation slightly, that's making the value of savings higher, which is going to encourage people to save, to utilise those higher interest rates, to discourage people from borrowing. It's going to put people into a cycle of misallocation of people chasing the returns rather than chasing what is the optimal economic thing to do. So that's why libertarians think things like the gold standard is awesome, because if you've got the gold standard, then you can't have central banks running around printing money, because the central bank can't create gold. So therefore, it's a trouble. Although if you've ever seen one of the greatest movies of all time, Hudson Hawk, it might in fact be possible to create gold out of lead. Anyway, moving on to the case for seriously, Google, Hudson Hawk, great, Bruce Willis, fantastic. And he doesn't blow up anything at all.
Why would we watch it then?
You totally don't watch it. It's free. You're all going to watch it now.
Yeah.
So the case for austerity is sorry, if the Keynesians are all about aggregate demand management, right? That's their thing. What the role of government is to manage aggregate economic demand. So when demand is down, the government should get in. When demand is up, the government should get out. That's their mantra. The Hayekian folks say that we shouldn't be managing demand. We should focus on supply side economics. Right? And supply side means making it as easy as possible for people to do business. So that's it. Not trying to run businesses for them, not trying to prop them up, but have low taxes, low regulations, get the hell out of the way, let the market do what it does. And Ronald Reagan was very famous for implementing what he called the supply side revolution in the US, where he basically slashed and burned environmental regulations and other kinds of prohibitions on behaviour and lowered interest rates and got the government out of the way to stop creating that investment, and said, we've created this boom in entrepreneurship in the US, and all these people could now get into the space that had been either vacated by the government or made impossible by regulation. So if you've got a depression or a recession, what that means as a Hayekian is that there's a misallocation of resources, that people have put their money in the wrong place. In the case of the US, too many people put their money in housing, it didn't make sense, it got out of control, too much money was being hoarded there, that's a glut. That glut has to clear. And the only way that glut is going to clear is to be very clear to people that those investments need to be divested of and that money has to go somewhere else. And if you think you can prop up the economy by making those bad investments somehow good again, then you're not going to encourage people to move into those areas of the economy that are productive and profitable. You're just going to prolong the pain. So you've got to avoid misallocation of capital. Stimulus distorts that process. As demand falls, the Keynesians will tell you, but demand falling is terrible, right? Demand falls, people lose their jobs. People who shouldn't lose their jobs, people whose businesses are perfectly awesome, lose their jobs, but there's just not enough consumers out there to buy anymore because everybody's hoarding their money under their mattress because they're shit scared. It's not because they don't want the product that business is selling, it's just they're too scared to consume. The Hayekians say, yeah, it's stiff shit. What happens is, so if businesses shut down, that means if there becomes a surplus of labour, or a surplus of capital, or a surplus of machinery, or a surplus of office space, or a surplus of all of the above, and those things become very cheap, and entrepreneurs use that cheapness to get into the market. So if you've been thinking, I'd really like to run a business, but office space is so expensive, then lots of businesses going bankrupt isn't awesome for you. You will see that office space becomes really, really cheap as the glut of office space grows, so you'll be able to get into the market and have a go. And if you fuck up, someone will just come in behind you and try a different business and hopefully make money. If you've always wanted to open your own bar, but the cost of hiring staff on the weekends is just oh so high, George Columbaris, you prick, then having a surplus of labour is great. You can open your cafe and you can employ people on the weekend at dirt cheap wages because otherwise they'll starve to death. And so this is what's referred to as the automatic stabilisers for the economy. That it might be a painful process, but ultimately in the long term it will be the best process, and it means that the total amount of time in which everything's fucked will be the shortest amount. The depth to which the economy plunges might be deeper, but the speed at which it recovers and the robustness of that recovery will be stronger because the recovery will be built on real economic principles. It will be built on people creating businesses and services that people want enough to be willing to put their hand in their pocket and pay for them, not being propped up artificially by the government, and that means those businesses will survive. You won't have the rent-seeking problem we had before of businesses getting stuck. And increasing government debt is not like a trivial, unimportant issue. Increasing government debt is an intergenerational burden. It's the generation of today borrowing, as conservatives in America like to say, it's putting it on the credit card for our grandchildren to pay off. That's not cool. We should want to leave the best economic situation for future generations as we can, and kind of basically buying now and paying later is a fine principle when you're talking about a pair of shoes. It's a bad principle when you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars which you can't pay back in your lifetime and you're leaving it to other people to pay back. Because it also crowds out investment and increases borrowing costs for the private sector, and those things are very important. Ooh, that's it. How am I going to time? I'm sure I've shattered it.
It's like 4 months. So what should do after?
Right, so that's it. The next bit's a year. We're not going to do now, so we've got like 2 minutes for questions, I guess, and then we're eating slightly.